The Bible, love it or hate it, is a book filled with puzzles and mysteries. It will be our task to unravel as many of them as possible. We want to understand the Bible as a human book, not a book inspired by a God. I'm Robert M. Price, and this is The Human Bible. I am your host, Robert M. Price, and this is The Human Bible. The Human Bible is a radio show and podcast of the Center for Inquiry, a think tank advancing science, reason, freedom of inquiry, and humanist values in public affairs and at the grassroots. Don't know if you noticed, but this is the 10th episode. It's always good to be in double digits. And I'm just so pleased at the response to the Human Bible, and it's got certain advantages over the other podcast I do, The Bible Geek, in that this forces me to pause and fill in some stuff that I may take for granted and that I shouldn't. And the Up to Speed segment, I just love that. And I like everything we do here, but I'd like to hear more feedback and criticism. I don't mind it. I welcome it. And most of all, suggestions. I'd like to know what you like on the show and would like to hear more of, what you could do without. And there's a survey that you can access at our site. There's a link at thehumanbible.net/survey. And please take advantage of this and let us know what you'd like to do with the show, because I guarantee we're going to take it seriously. Well, it's time again for Up to Speed.
Up to Speed.
And this time I'd like to just push our focus on form criticism just a little bit farther and zero in on yet another part of the Bible, another little genre, you might say, of biblical material that is familiar in some ways and not in others. I find that the Psalms are often almost inevitably quoted out of context because nobody seems to know what the context was. What are we reading here? Are these just poems of religious devotion? That seems a little odd given the, frankly, bloodthirsty character of some of them. But then there are very poignant lyrics in here. What are these things? Well, the word psalm really is Greek, and it denotes a piece of music to be accompanied by instruments, but this is a Greek term for it. I think in Hebrew it just means the book of praises, and it's a compilation of 5 earlier hymn books, and that does seem to be what the whole thing is, a hymn book. And it's, I believe I've mentioned before how it's very handy that it has very old, archaic elements that vanish from other parts of the Bible, and the reason for this being that just like in modern times, people don't like their beloved hymns fooled around with. So there's some stuff there that some old mythology that we read, and it gives us a good window into what all Israelites once believed. Well, there are different kinds of psalms, and I'm going to deal with one today, an example that is very helpful for understanding something in the New Testament. And in fact, there are some psalm-like texts in the New Testament, but we're zeroing in on the Old Testament psalms. And there's a couple of groups of psalms that are called lament psalms, and I guess you could just call them lamentations, but that tends to confuse people with the very short book of Lamentations. But I guess it shouldn't, because there are 5 lyrics there that are essentially the same kind of thing. They're all attributed to Jeremiah, and the occasion is very specific: mourning for the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 586 BCE. But what the heck, these are lamentations too. Traditionally, scholars of the Psalms like Hermann Gunkel and Sigmund Mowinckel, who did the great pioneering work on this, they have divided the lament psalms into 2 categories: the individual laments and the community laments. Now, some scholars think that it's a little messier than that because there are some good reasons to think that virtually all of the Psalms were written for the use of the king, that he would symbolize the nation in his person, and that when the laments are sung, they're really about national calamities and impending dooms, battles, famines, things like that, and that the king is giving voice to what most people probably feel. I don't know how to evaluate that. It's plausible, but then so are all the different theories of this. But it seems to me there's reason to believe that they weren't just for the king, that these things were on record, so to speak, in the hymnal, the Psalter, as they call it, and that people would come in when they were in trouble and ask to have one of the Levitical singers sing one of these things with their name on it. It's sort of like having a mass for somebody, right? And you'd make a donation, and you'd perhaps pick out one or get the singer to pick one out, and this would express your feelings to God. And here is probably the most famous of the bunch, Psalm 22. Now, you'll immediately recognize this from the New Testament, parts of which are in it and have influenced it. And there, and because of that, like in the crucifixion narrative in Mark 14, people often say this is a prophecy of the crucifixion of Christ. Well, as you'll see, read on its own terms, it has nothing to do with that, though you'll see what ambiguous wording led people to stumble on this and say, hey, could this have a future reference? But the point today is, what did it mean originally to the ancient Israelites? And so here it is. I'll probably skip some of it, but I want to pause in my usual traffic jam manner and comment on the text. Starts out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me, from the words of my groaning? O my God, I cry by day, but thou dost not answer, and by night, but find no rest. Yet thou art holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In thee our fathers trusted, they trusted, and thou didst deliver them. To thee they cried and were saved. In thee they trusted and were not disappointed. But I am a worm and no man, scorned by men and despised by the people. All who see me mock at me. They make mouths at me, they wag their heads. He committed his cause to Yahweh. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. Yet thou art he who took me from the womb. Thou didst keep me safe upon my mother's breasts. Upon thee was I cast from my birth, and since my mother bore me, thou hast been my God. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, and there is none to help. Many bulls encompass me. Strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. Let me pause there. What is going on here? What's exactly the trouble? Well, nothing is exactly the trouble, and that's the point. The idea is that some kind of terrible problem has rendered this guy an object of ridicule and scorn. Nobody wants to help him as he brought it on himself. He doesn't exactly say. Now, some of these laments have people confessing, oh, yeah, I'm a sinner, that's for sure, but can't you forgive me and give me a break? We don't really hear that. We don't know exactly what's supposed to be wrong. This doesn't seem to have been written by somebody reflecting on an actual concrete crisis he's in. And the vagueness is important to the genre because it's sort of all-purpose. You fill in your own name and your own problems. That's the whole idea of it. That's why there are these potent but vague metaphors, like the guy being surrounded by these wild bulls and so on. His troubles are flanking him. What are they exactly? Could it be creditors after him? Could it be that he's accidentally killed somebody and the guy's relatives are after him? The Old Testament mentions that as something that happened back then. Is he sick? Or is the king talking about an impending battle where the odds aren't very good? We don't really know, but it's important that it isn't badly written. That is the whole idea, fill in the blank here. So he's saying, He's like reminding God, you helped our ancestors, and I'm hoping you might help me. I've always been committed to you. Maybe it's time for you to hold up your end of the bargain. All my life I've been your worshiper. I need you now. Well, okay, back to verse 14. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaves to my jaws. Thou dost lay me in the dust of death. Yea, dogs are round about me. A company of evildoers encircled me. And the Hebrew was a little confused here. It's either they have pierced my hands and feet, or, believe it or not, it could also be like a lion, my hands and feet. In other words, going back to 16, yea, dogs are round about me, a company of evildoers encircle me like a lion. My hands and feet, I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my raiment they cast lots. So it's like I've got jackals and a lion circling me. As I try to fend them off, they rip at the tender flesh of my palms, and so forth. I'm starving. I'm wasting away, and everybody's just laughing at me. They've given me up for dead, and they're figuring, okay, who gets what? He's not going to need the stuff anymore. 19, but thou, O Yahweh, O Lord, be not far off. O thou my help, hasten to my aid. Deliver my soul from the sword, my life from the power of the dog. Save me from the mouth of the lion, my afflicted soul from the horns of the wild oxen. Then changes mood, and that's because the singer, the suppliant, is not despairing. He wants to show he has confidence in God, even though it's late in the day. It's the 11th hour. I don't think you've given up on me, and I'm not giving up. I know you are going to come through, and when you do, I'll come back to the temple, and I'll have a different psalm sung, one of the Thanksgiving hymns, and I will offer sacrifice and will divide up the meat among the poor who come to the temple, and I'll be happy to do it, to tell them how you saved me, because I know you will. Okay, it says 22, I will tell of thy name to my brethren. In the midst of the congregation I will praise thee. And I'll say, you who fear the Lord, praise him. All you sons of Jacob, glorify him, and stand in awe of him, all you sons of Israel. For he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hid his face from him, but has heard when he cried to him. And then there's more to it, but it's kind of, and it's all beautifully done. But that's the big point. So is this a prediction or a prophecy of anything? No. And furthermore, I wouldn't say that Mark was so stupid, the New Testament writer, as to think that it was. If anything, it was a kind of a Dead Sea Scrolls idea that, we know the literal meaning of it, but I bet you there was sort of smuggled in there by the Holy Spirit some esoteric meaning that we can now see, completely out of context. It's a secret meaning. We can now see it after it's been fulfilled, and what do you know? Maybe this was predicting the crucifixion. How about that piercing hands and feet? Aha! Suppose that means crucifixion. Yeah, I mean, it's if they thought anything about it, they thought that, and that is an admission that isn't what it was literally about, right? I mean, you can decide it had some secret meaning if you want. That's at least not a claim, a bogus claim that the writer was just on the face of it predicting the crucifixion, as fundamentalists often say. That's a misreading. Oh, boy, I'd like to get further into this, like how Mark doesn't actually say it's a prophecy. He doesn't, as he and Matthew often do, say this happened to fulfill the scripture which said. Now, he doesn't necessarily want you to notice, though he has based his crucifixion account on bits and pieces of this psalm. But that's really for another time. I'd like to take a crack at another couple of categories of Psalms next time. And it's just amazing how much more sense the Psalms make once you have some idea of the ancient use and setting of them. There's a segment we do, I'd say every other time, called Apologetics is Never Having to Say You're Sorry. I don't even know why I named it that, because I'm probably the only one here old enough to get the joke, right? The movie Love Story by Eric Siegel. Love is never having to say you're sorry. Kind of weird view of love, but, the rest of you who are not fossils and relics like me, that's at least the joke, right? Now, here's one I usually come up with myself, but I'm delighted someone sent in a question that fits into this category. Tim writes, it's not hard to find places in the Bible where God changes his mind or changes the law, changes the route to salvation. How do apologists square this with God never changing? Like you're right, in James, there's no shadow of turning with him. Or Hebrews, he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. But doesn't it seem that way? Like the big one, right, would be in the flood story. God sees the stink and wickedness. I guess he must be watching the news on TV. The wickedness of the human race, and he says, I am sorry I ever invented these creeps. I think I'm going to start over, and he drowns them all like rats. Well, wait a minute, he didn't know this was going to happen? What's going on here? And you can come up with loads of other ones too. Let's just jump to the other end of the thing, where Adolf Harnack pointed this out in his great book, What is Christianity, written in the early 20th century. He said, now, you mean to tell me that Jesus knew that very shortly the whole plan of salvation was going to change? Here he is preaching publicly, let's say, the parable of the prodigal son. Yes, folks, all you need to do is repent and seek God's forgiveness, and it doesn't matter what you've done, doesn't matter how far gone you are, he'll forgive you and welcome you back. Well, he's saying this even though he must know that in a couple of weeks, the cosmos is going to change, and suddenly, no, repenting is not good enough. You've got to believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus for your sins. You got to be baptized, and you got to believe A, B, and C. Well, wait a minute. If that was in the works, why did he give him this plan of salvation that is much simpler and doesn't involve any of that stuff? And Harnack said it's pretty obvious that the historical Jesus couldn't have been teaching Christian doctrine. That's been added in later, and somebody's forgotten to erase the clues as to what it was originally about. So, yeah, now you see that's an explanation of the contradiction. Or let's explain the thing with the flood, too, in ancient terms. Did the ancients have any problem with God changing his mind and not anticipating the future? No, they didn't, because they thought of God as a super powerful being, essentially like Zeus or Odin, right? There was no problem with that. I mean, he didn't know the future. He just made it. He would announce what would happen because he was so powerful, nobody could force him to change his plans. He didn't have some clairvoyant knowledge of the future. So God was a being, probably even with a humanoid body, and he was more or less like us. Now, the apologists for what? The defenders of the faith, the medieval to modern theology of Christianity. Probably some of this in Orthodox Judaism too, but I can't speak to that. But I do know the Christian theology. They got a problem because the notion of God was redefined in light of philosophy. And this started in late antiquity with people like St. Augustine, who was a big Platonist. He loved Plato, and and then you have the same thing with St. Anselm and Thomas Aquinas in later centuries. These guys said that philosophy is pretty good, and given the stuff the Bible says about God, God really would have to be eternal and unchanging and all-knowing, and So that creates a problem, right? How could this omniscient, that is all-knowing and all-powerful God, who sees everything in a single glance, he's outside of the limitations of time that imprison us. Now you got a problem. If you don't say God is like that, if you say, well, God is very much like Zeus, as I just did, that seemed kind of inadequate. That looked bad. It was like Greek mythology rather than Greek philosophy, and anybody could see that the philosophy is more advanced than the mythology, and so they were doing the same with the Bible. But now what did the Greeks do when they applied allegory and reason to their scriptures, the Iliad and the Odyssey and the myths and all that? They wanted to be rational too, and so they said, well, is God really like Homer depicts Zeus? I don't think so. That's unbecoming. Now, I bet it's really an allegorical symbol for the divine logos, the divine creative reason that permeates all things, that is the inner essence of all things. So no personal God, right? And that's the problem that the Christian theologians inherited when they used philosophy to redefine God. Now, not only was it ludicrous to think that God didn't know the future and that he would be disappointed by his creatures, but you just couldn't take Bible statements at their face value. John Calvin said, well, yeah, I know it says that, but that's divine accommodation. It's just sort of making God look like us so that God will be more understandable. Of course, that seems like a cheap dodge to me, because if it's depicting God the opposite of the way God really is, that's not much of a symbol. Right? There's a huge problem with that, and it gets even worse, because as Anselm in the 10th century realized, you couldn't even really literally say God loves us. I mean, how could he? How could he have human emotions, given that we've made him into a kind of an abstraction? I shouldn't even say him, maybe it. But what's the Bible trying to say? Well, I guess it just means that whatever is going on in God's head, if he has one, it's as if, in effect, that he loves us. Well, that's great. That's cold comfort, it seems like. Does God actually have wrath? Well, no, it's just saying that if you go against the laws that God has built into the universe, you're going to wish you hadn't, like sticking your finger in an electrical socket. You're not going to get shocked because God is punishing you. You're just flouting the laws of nature. So you could call it the wrath of God, but it really isn't. Well, what is? I mean, you've got real problems. Like Aristotle said, that if every action, even just getting up out of the chair I'm in and going into the kitchen, is a motion from potentiality to actuality, in that I was potentially in the kitchen a moment ago, but I hadn't realized that potential. But now that I'm standing in the kitchen, I have. I mean, if even that is moving from potential to actuality, well, look, God is pure act, as Aristotle said. God is actualized from the word go. There remains no potentiality unfulfilled in God, or God would not be perfect. So God cannot act. Every act is going from potential to actual. It can't be. Plus, if you say God exists outside of time, how can you say God acts? How can you say God thinks? One thought after the other? No. Does God have plans? That implies he's not all powerful. Things would be as he wants them right now all the time. So you wind up with a kind of Hindu non-dualist idea that God isn't really even involved in the world, but is some kind of ground of being, as Paul Tillich would say. This happened implicitly the minute they tried to philosophize theology. And this is why Pascal said the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is not the God of the philosophers. So this is the huge, huge problem embedded in the question you're asking, because the biblical writers had no problem with this. They didn't think God was unchanging, except in the sense that his character is reliable. But theology has gone way far beyond that, and some would say down the drain. So thanks, Tim. Yeah, that's a place where apologetics really sinks the ship trying to bail it out, I think. Okay, some more questions. Oh boy, this one's about one of my favorites. Ryan writes, I have a question about Enoch, the grandfather or great-grandfather of Noah. I'm just reading Paradise Lost, and Milton makes quite a big deal about Enoch. I didn't even remember who he was. In the Bible, he's only mentioned briefly. I've come to discover there is a book of Enoch, and that some Catholics include it in their teachings. Actually, I don't think it's the Catholics. The Ethiopian church does have it in their huge biblical canon. Anyway, I was wondering who this Enoch really is and if it's worth reading his book. Thanks. Love your show. Oh, boy, there's loads to be said about this, but I'll try to keep it short. Enoch is depicted as just one of the patriarchs before the flood who was fantastically long-lived, though a kind of a piker compared to the other ones. Like, he's said to live 365 years. Well, compare that to old Methuselah, which some people are probably going to be calling me after my birthday tomorrow. Anyway, he lives 969 years. Well, I guess 365 is better than the lifespan I'll have. Who was Enoch, really? I mean, because obviously there was nobody that lived that long. Well, Enoch seems to have been the sun god, one of several sun god characters in the Old Testament. Enoch is another version of the name and the character Enmedoranki, a Babylonian character. He was originally the same character as Noah. In fact, the two names are almost the same in Hebrew. And the idea was that the sun rises above the flood and the rain, and hence when you make Enoch or Noah the flood survivor, you're really talking about the sun anyhow. But the brief little snippet, as you mentioned, about Enoch in Genesis 5, I guess it is, says that he lived for 365 years, and then he walked with God and was not found, for God took him. Well, that's very much like the story of Elijah, who was another biblical sun god, who, there it's explicit, he rises into the sky aboard a flaming chariot. Well, there's Apollo for you, right? Same thing. Enoch was not to be found on earth because the sun rose. He walked with God across the circle of the sky because he's the sun, right? The sun, S-U-N, in the sky. And the 365 years, well, come on, that's got to be a reference to the solar calendar. Now, that, by the way, is a big issue associated with Enoch much later on in Judaism. You mention a book of Enoch. Boy, people just couldn't get enough of Enoch because that book, which is quoted in the New Testament verbatim in the Epistle of Jude, in fact, most of Jude is based on what we call First Enoch. We have the text, of course, and this book itself is a composite of 5 earlier books of Enoch. So the same thing about the Psalms. That's the same thing, too. A little Pentateuch, a 5-book collection. And not only that, there were other books of Enoch that are mentioned in Jewish texts, books we don't have, but we do have another one called The Secrets of Enoch, slightly later, and then a medieval one called, well, I guess... So anyway, we call it Third Enoch. And we even have these things in other languages. Our copy of First Enoch is in Ethiopic, the translation from the original Hebrew. And then Third Enoch is in Hebrew, but Second Enoch, or The Secrets of Enoch, is in Slavonic. Now, what the heck is it doing in that? It's Old Russian. Well, because it was widely dispersed in different translations and used in different churches and so on. And these books all have the idea that Enoch was taken to heaven and transfigured. Now, once they became monotheistic, they didn't want to have him as the sun god, but you can tell it came from there because in 2nd and 3rd Enoch, they have Enoch rising into heaven like Jesus at the ascension and being turned into a fiery angel. And he's given the name the Lesser Yahweh or the Little Jehovah, and he has a throne of his own at the right hand of God. Does this remind you of anything? In 1st Enoch, he's called the one like a son of man, or that son of man, or the son of man who was born unto righteousness. And he's sort of identified with the Messiah, and one day the transfigured Enoch will come back to judge the earth, etc., etc. In the Quran, he appears as Idris, Idries in English. So he's a major, major character and had virtually a kind of a Jewish denomination unto himself. And he lurks in the background of the New Testament. I think he's mentioned in 1 Peter, though it's been kind of garbled, but I restored it in my pre-Nicene New Testament version. Tertullian, the Carthaginian church father at the end of the 2nd century, believed that 1st Enoch ought to be in the Bible. And again, the Ethiopian church does have it. So there's all kinds of stuff about this guy who never existed. That's not a bad resume for a guy that never existed. Peter says, I understand that it is likely that this question could be or has been the basis for a PhD thesis, but I was wondering if you could spend some time talking about the 10 Commandments. I'm wondering if there were always 10. Why 10? Were all 10 written by the same person or group? And if any of them have meanings that differ from the way we think of them today. Oh boy, this is fun. It looks as if people, well, we know that Jewish rabbis, Jewish scribes debated for hundreds of years, what's the greatest commandment? This comes up in the Gospels, right? Master, what's the greatest commandment? He says, well, of course, number one is the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, and shall worship him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second's just like it, love your neighbors yourself. They used to rank them, and apparently what we have as the 10 Commandments was somebody's list of the top 10 commandments. And now why? Why 10? And you needed to know them. You didn't have your own copy of the Bible. You needed to know them to try to keep your nose clean. And in one of the Psalms, it says, who's worthy to go up to the Temple Mount and worship? Well, the one who was like this and like that and the other. And it lists 10 traits, character traits. The guy that doesn't break his word, et cetera, et cetera. 10 so you could count them off on your fingers and remember them. I know that sounds kind of silly, but that's probably true. We don't know, but that's probably the best guess. It's just a mnemonic device. So people would come up with the top 10, and there were different guesses, which is why Exodus gives us 2 different lists of 10 commandments. The familiar one is in Exodus 20. And the other, and that's pretty much reproduced in the book of Deuteronomy. But the one that's very different is in Exodus 34, which has 3 of the same commandments, albeit worded differently, and then 7 other ones, including the one you're so tempted to violate all the time. You shall not seethe or boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. Now, I know that's a toughie. Right. What on earth? Well, most of those are ritual in character, attending festivals in Jerusalem, the wheat harvest, all kinds of stuff like that, whereas most of the ones in Exodus 20 are a matter of civil or moral law. No coveting, no perjury, things like that. Just 2 different top 10 lists, and each was a favorite, and so the compiler of Exodus didn't feel like he could leave either of them out. So what does he do? Well, and it's the second group in 34 that's actually called the 10 Commandments, oddly. So he just puts a bunch of chapters between them and pretends that the second one is a new copy of the first, hoping you will forgotten what the first 10 are by the time you get to 34. So it's interesting. Now, it looks like that originally you just had 10 short little sentences. It depicts Moses holding stone tablets, and there are plenty of those that survive from the ancient world, and they're small. They're about the size of a piece of paper or two. And so it couldn't have been the rather lengthy text we now read in Exodus 20, much less the hugely expanded version in 34. But you remember how in Exodus 20, they're all some of them are very short. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And they've been added to as people figured they needed to be specified more. And that's why some of them are rather long, like the Sabbath commandment. It gives a couple of different reasons for why the Sabbath is holy and so on. And threats are added to a couple of them and so on. But originally they were just 10 short and sweet commandments. Where they got them, who knows? They may have just been popular maxims or something, but we have to assume different people came up with the two different lists, or decalogues, as they're called, a set of literally 10 words. So the 10 Commandments. I'm especially interested in what you say about did they mean something different? Well, there are two of them, at least in the Exodus 20 list, that do have significant differences. It's hard to be absolutely sure, but the one that we usually hear, thou shalt not kill, probably doesn't mean blanket killing. There is a separate word for that, but if you look at how the various Hebrew words for life-taking occur and the context in the rest of the Hebrew Bible, it looks like the one used here means murder. It wouldn't have a reference to killing in war. It would really be almost impossible to imagine the ancients having a commandment like that. But it doesn't seem to mean that. They even have distinctions between murder and manslaughter. So apparently that one just means you shall not murder. In some translations, I guess most of them today put it that way. But the more interesting one to me is, you shall not take, well, here's the way we usually have it, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Well, that's pretty handy, because if you're reading that, you can't take it in vain. It actually says in the Hebrew, you shall not take the name of Yahweh, or Jehovah, your God, in vain. That is his personal name. God is almost more of a title. It's a more generic term. And the point of this is, don't use it wrong. How's that? Well, it looks like, again, if you look elsewhere in the Old Testament, you look for what it would mean to take the name of Yahweh, period. And then you can see what taking it in vain, that is wrongly, would mean. Well, it looks like what they're trying to tell you is not to commit perjury, because there are places where a defendant is put on oath, and it will say, give glory to Yahweh now, tell the truth. And so that was putting you on oath. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth? Their version of that. Now, if you said, and then what would you say on the stand? You would say, as Yahweh lives, I didn't steal your lawnmower. So you are invoking the name of the living God, and the point is, well, nothing's more true than that. That's the truest you can get, but what I'm about to say is that true, and I didn't do it. Okay, if it turns out that we find out you did, look what you've done, buddy. You've invoked the name of Yahweh in vain. You're calling him to witness that you didn't do it when you did. That's taking his name in vain. Or suppose you and I make a contract for you to build me a house or something, and you say, okay, I will have the job done in a month as Yahweh lives. You can depend on me, but it turns out you don't finish the job and you run off to Miami with my money. Breach of contract. It seems to mean that, either perjury or breach of contract or both. But as time went by, nobody was really more sure than we are today, and they began to say, look, what the heck? Let's play it safe. How about if none of us ever mention the name Yahweh, even while reading the text that has the name in it? So they would always put a little asterisk or something in there. If you're reading the text in a synagogue service, you'd get to it and you would not say Yahweh. You would say instead Adonai, another name of God, but again more like a title. It means the Lord, and that's where we get the custom in most English Bibles of having the Lord there when it actually says Yahweh. You remember we talked about this way back, that if you find the word Lord printed in all caps, that's not what it really says. It says Yahweh, or Jehovah if you prefer. But if you find it in regular capitalization and small letters, that's Adonai. So yeah, that commandment meant something rather different than what we think, and the ambiguity about what it meant led to a masking of the original wording in our translations. I love wacky stuff like this. Well, is that in the Bible?
Is that in the Bible?
Now, what we just talked about was weird enough, you might say, but I'd like to get into something that's even weirder. Now, I was reading Charles Cutler Torrey's book, Our Translated Gospels, and I don't want to get into the long and short of that, but at one point he's talking about this thing in Luke where it says in the end of the age that people will be cowering in fear at the churning of the ocean. And the author says, why is this in there? That wasn't part of apocalyptic belief. You know, what would happen at the end of the world? It doesn't make sense. And I thought to myself, your problem, buddy, is you haven't seen enough Godzilla movies. Because when Godzilla is getting ready to come up out of the sea and stomp on Tokyo again, they see this incredible churning of the water and they say, uh-oh, what's going on here? And so this guy should have known that, because the Bible speaks of the rising out of the sea of dragons at the end of the age, right? In the book of Revelation, the seven-headed dragon rises out of the sea, and people seeing that churning, they'd be a little upset. Now, are you sure, Price, that there's that this comparison with Godzilla is apt? Well, yes, I am. Let's take a fast look at Job 41. God has shown up, and he's sick of Job smart-mouthing him and says, listen, Mr. Know-it-all, I bet you don't, you really don't know what you're talking about, do you? And do you know this? Can you explain that? The migration of birds, the arrangement of the constellations, how about it? And Job's answer is pretty much, no. Well, and here's another one of those questions where God kind of boasts of his own knowledge. In chapter 41, he says to Job, can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? In other words, God has done this. Can Job do it? Will he make many supplications, that is, beg for mercy, to you? Will he speak to you in soft words? Will he make a covenant with you to take him for your servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird, or will you put him on a leash for your maidens, you little girls? And so on. 7, can you fill his skin with harpoons, or his head with fishing spears? That is, I have, God says. Lay hands on him. Think of the battle. You will not do it again. And more about him. Get a load of this. If there was any ambiguity, it ought to vanish now. Verse 12, I will not keep silence concerning his limbs or his mighty strength or his goodly frame. Who can strip off his outer garment? Who can penetrate, skin the fish? Who can penetrate his double coat of mail? Who can open the doors of his face, the jaws? Round about his teeth is terror. His back is made of rows of shields, shut up closely as with a seal. One is so near to another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another. They clasp each other and cannot be separated. His sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn goddess. Out of his mouth go flaming torches. Sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils comes forth smoke as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals and a flame comes forth from his mouth, etc., etc., etc. Yeah, we've got an armor-plated dragon that breathes fire. Is that in the Bible? You bet your sweet bippy it is. But there are some people that say, no, it's just a crocodile. Yeah, that's the ticket. I find this amazing that people who will defend the occurrence of miracles in the Bible, guys rising into the sky, people walking on water, people making axe heads float up to the surface, they don't want to go with dragons. That's a little too mythical for them, but is it in the Bible? You bet it is. Well, that's it for another exciting episode of the Human Bible. And again, I would really encourage and urge and request you to go to thehumanbible.net/survey and give us some feedback and some suggestions. I guarantee we'll take them quite seriously. Thanks a bunch. See you next time. Thanks for joining me on this episode of The Human Bible. To send us questions or comments on the show, which we really hope you do, you can email questions@thehumanbible.net or feedback@thehumanbible.net. We're also on Twitter @HumanBible, on Facebook @/TheHumanBible. And you can even leave a voicemail on our Human Bible hotline by calling 716-71-BIBLE. You can get all that information and more on our website, thehumanbible.net. Views expressed on the Human Bible aren't necessarily the views of the Center for Inquiry, nor its affiliated organizations. The Human Bible is produced by Adam Isaac in Amherst, New York, and features contributions from Debbie Goddard. I'm your host, Robert M. Price.